everyone. Happy to see many faces back here again after lunch. So seems like the first speeches were quite interesting. So people are coming back, and welcome to everyone who didn't join us before here. I'm Robert. I'm the MC of the day, and we've heard a couple of talks already about failing and failures and how to don't do things right. But I think it's a great thing if people share their failures. Usually you only hear success stories, which is kind of boring. And yeah, we all know a failure belongs to life, and everyone can learn a lot. Everyone can learn a lot from failures. And how to fail forward is now presented by Ola HOLMDAHL from formerly Junebud, now at Tarsier Studios, and I'm happy to having him here and to hear about what he's learned and how to fail forward. Welcome, Ola.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So let me start up with some demarcations. This is exactly a lecture themed around failure and constructive failure versus catastrophic failure. And it's a 20-minute lecture with 15 minutes of speaking time, about 5 minutes of questions. So I'm not going to solve world problems here, but it's very much a subjective process, or what I've learned, how I see, how my current thoughts around failure work. And I hope it will prove useful, perhaps inspirational, perhaps cautionary, to as many of you as possible. So let's start off with myself and whether or not it's a good idea to relate to my experiences. I started up in the industry as an illustrator, concept illustrator, in the mid-90s with board games and live role-playing and some computer gaming. Moved on to become a game designer at what became DICE Stockholm, worked with Battlefield series as a game designer. From there I went on to become a game design teacher at the University of Skövde, trying to gather my thoughts around game design. And from that career I moved on to become an entrepreneur. And 2008 I founded Junebud along with two other main partners, which was a company based in south of Sweden, and it was aimed at making super accessible games. That is free games, that is games accessible for mobile devices, browser, the lightest weight formats we could imagine at the time. Junebud declared bankruptcy in the summer of 2012, and I've recently, after sorting out the administration of that bankruptcy, I've recently taken up work with Tarsier Studios, also in the south of Sweden, in Malmö. So, the theme is failure. It's just 14 slides, so roughly a slide a minute. I'm going to talk about the Junebud experience first, and then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about having room to fail and what demarcates, what describes room to fail, and how to get the most value out of failure-based experiences. And then hopefully there will be some time for questions. This is a picture from the Junebud office, our snazzy art director, and some other people in the background. Happy times. This is the spring of 2012, I believe. So we went from about 6 people, very hardcore, working off of savings, sweat equity, and all these good stuff, all these good things. In 2008, 2009, we got some early funding after using our own savings, and we eventually listed the company in 2009 in the fall off on a very small trading place, a stock exchange in Stockholm, that worked pretty much as startup capital for seed capital for small ventures, technology ventures. And that turned out to be a double-edged sword, because it made it very, very hard to bring on further capital down the line, and it diluted ownership somewhat. But it got us started, and let me tell you, nothing works in a null context, and starting a game company in the fall of 2008 during a raging international double-dip depression was quite interesting, but also quite possible. So what did we do at Junebud? We made Milmo, which is a browser-based MMO game, platform adventure game with some light RPG elements, that eventually found its market primarily in Brazil. So this is the Portuguese version with lots of Portuguese players with Portuguese names. We made a game eventually called Tough Tanks. You can see some concept art from that up top, which was an artillery shooter in the style of Worms for the iPad. Milmo was our love child. That was the concept we really started the company around, and the first game we built, and we built it off of the capital we had raised. That capital eventually ran out. Milmo plateaued at a point where it kind of paid its own bills to some extent, but didn't generate the revenue we needed. So, like a lot of indie-esque startups, we had to revert to work for hire. We found an American company called Area Games. They've been here and lectured, and agreed with them to make a iPad game that turned out to be Tough Tanks, released in the summer of 2012. And the last image there is from a prototype we were working on called World of the Dead. It was a sort of action RPG, survival zombie themed game that we were working on. It was absolutely cross-platform. It's pretty cool. You could play it on an iPhone or Android phone. You could play it on a tablet. You could play it on your PC, up on a big monitor, and play with each other or against each other in a survival-based world. And that's one of the many games we try to pitch towards the end of our history as a company. So everything from kind of big MMO thinkings down to very small, casual, sort of arcadey titles. But we failed. We didn't manage to find any follow-up projects after Tough Tanks. And Tough Tanks was a bit of a problem because Area Games wanted us to build Tough Tanks, release Tough Tanks, see how Tough Tanks did for about 6 months with just a minimal live team, and then discuss making other projects or follow-up projects. And when we started talking to other people to try and find new work for hire, they also said, okay, what are you doing now? Well, we're doing this iPad game. Great, when is it due for release? Summer 2012. All right, then we'll wait and see how that does before we decide whether or not we want to work with you. That's really a catch-22, because we were like a 20-man company, we were already publicly listed, we had quite the burn rate, and we couldn't easily just boil it down to 5 or 6 people, because we had so much overhead at that point. So eventually, at the end of summer 2012, we decided to declare bankruptcy because we simply had hit enough milestones that told us that it was not viable anymore to bring it around and make it an economic success. And it was the most responsible thing to do to all our stakeholders, our employees, our partners, our investors, our clients, was to make it as graceful a shutdown as possible. This is me in 2008 and me in 2012. I remember I tweeted after the bankruptcy had been declared, this reminds me of the final scene of Das Boot. I don't know if you've seen that movie. It's a German submarine movie from the 70s. Jürgen Prochnow plays a submarine captain who goes through hell with his crew, and they finally make it back to dock in basically one piece, and then they get bombed and sink. And that was the feeling of having struggled for 4 years, extremely hard, no stops, everything you could think of, your entire network, your entire knowledge base, your best friends, your best partners, and still it just would not work. So, we started out with a quote, a famous quote by Benjamin Franklin. I've only failed. I've learned how not to do it 100 times over in trying to invent the light bulb. This is Supercell CEO Ilkka Paananen, who basically says on this quote, yeah, we really like success. Whenever we're successful, we have a beer and pat each other's backs. But when we fail spectacularly, we break out the champagne and have a huge party, because then that's where we're really understanding what we're doing and what doesn't work, and thus how to move forward. And that's from 2012, when they were up at $750,000 a day. They're up to $1 million a day by now. So, thinking about failure, a lot of people are starting to talk about failure, as noted. And yes, failure is inevitable. So, the only really important feature of failure is scale. How serious is it, and can you recover from it? Usually you can. The lack of failure is very dangerous. You have to make mistakes and iterate, adjust your course, keep moving forward. So you have to condition yourself to like mistakes. Athletes do that. Elite military members do it. Artists do it. They keep trying to find that thing that will strike gold or resonate with a with truth within them. So yeah, as an entrepreneur, how many in here are entrepreneurs, by the way? You know all this. You have to learn to love failure because you're going to fail a lot. So I had this discussion with the producer we had. She was convinced that the best place to be was a well-founded startup, which means you have the money you need to pay salaries and move forward and fail and experiment, but you're still a startup and you have all the agility and all the promise that's in that. There are a couple of ways to meet this criteria. The important thing that I've learned is manageable burn rate. You can achieve that in a great many ways. You can just live in your mother's basement, off of whatever you scrape off the basement floor. That will give you a very low burn rate. You can grab a huge investment if you're good at speaking to VCs or you have a rich aunt. Or you can just make sure that each project you try requires very little time and investment, so you can go through a lot of them in whatever budget you've managed to establish. So well-funded is the main takeaway from this slide. Is well-funded just means work within your means and have plenty of room for iteration and complete startovers. Failure is very popular. Agile is based around failure, of course, because it says we're going to fail so much that waterfall doesn't really describe a software project, and even less so an entertainment industry software project. So whenever you read an agile book, go to one of these agile lectures, failure is a big part of it. Google Fridays, you get the best engineers in the best environment, you pay them a lot, you try to retain them. What do? You just take 20% of their time, one Friday out of every week, and say, do whatever you feel like, it doesn't have to be productive, just try stuff. That's quite the investment. So someone at Google, of course, thinks that failure is great, or at least useful. The Valve workspace, this is sort of a grail state for a lot of game developers. We read about it, we hear about it. People in most game development offices over a certain size try to implement a version of it. But the idea around the Valve workspace, except that everything's on wheel and can be carted around, is that people go where the action is. I.e., if someone has a project going on and it seems really exciting and draws a lot of attention to it, people move over there and start helping out with it, which, of course, the corollary there is that all the people who don't have as exciting a project going on fail. And the next time they go, how am I going to have all my colleagues come over to my desk and look at my project and try to help make that successful? So it's built also into the Valve workspace model. So while failure is popular, disaster is not popular. Disaster is a very sudden and great loss or damage to something like a business or maybe a boat, a cruise liner. Catastrophe, the tragic outcome of a personal or public situation, maybe a company, maybe a listed company. Emphasis on the destruction or irreplaceable loss of something. During Hurricane Katrina, I heard a very interesting definition of catastrophe, which is, it is when the scope of the damage exceeds the resources to hand to deal with the damage. Which is to say, you don't have enough fire trucks, you don't have enough rescue helicopters, you don't have enough people who know CPR to deal with the damage, so you'll have more damage than you can cope with in the foreseeable future. So of course, this sort of catastrophe, this sort of disaster is what we must strive to avoid. Even if something happens that leads to, say, a bankruptcy, that is not, while that is a disaster on the scale of Katrina for the company, it doesn't mean that all the people involved have suffered something absolutely disastrous. But the company has and the organization is gone, and maybe the value that's been built within it. So failure, try to reduce the scope of failure if possible, even if you embrace it and welcome it. So with Junebud, our company, right, I'm a contingency planner. Even from day one, I thought to myself, what's the worst that could happen? Well, clearly we could go bankrupt, we could fail, we could have someone get hit by a bus, all these things, horrible things. But what actually happened, even though we went all the way to failure, we brought in at least $1.5 million straight into the local economy, paying bills and training and helping people raise their kids. Lovely. That just was not there before we decided to start this company and run it. Over a dozen people, out of 20 people, about 12 came straight from gaming educations or mod communities. We had a very young crew. Like 3 true seniors with like 10 or so years, 5 mid-range established journeyman game developers, and then the rest were just noobs. And they got started. each and every one of the people at Jumbo have now gone on to work with other companies, exciting companies of all sizes. Dice, King, tiny little startups. Some concept artists and a gameplay program are currently in the United Arab Emirates trying to build a game prototype for some very rich man there who knows nothing about games. So it's all over board, but they're all on their way with their careers now, 4 years later. And for me personally, I've led a pretty interesting life. I've always tried to take chances, do new things, learn things, travel, but never in my life have I learned more than during these 4 years as a CEO and entrepreneur with a company in this business. So the personal gain is absolutely tremendous on most levels, even though this is a disaster for the organization and for the people who really had a lot of hopes riding on it. So I've made this little almost joke-like forefielder. I am a sociologist by training, but there's no science behind any of what I'm showing you. Please remember that. But basically, you got your financial responsibility when you think of you fail, do you succeed? And yeah, financials, I think they're easy because it's a set of rules. Some of them are more flexible than others, but they're there and they have an interpretation. You can just learn the rules and you can choose to follow them, or where to sort of skim them. Legal, the same way. Bring in an expert consultant, a lawyer, a business consultant. Learn it yourself. Maybe you are legally trained, a PhD or something, or a Juris Doctor. Learn it, follow it, apply it. The moral responsibility that you always have when you're a public figure, you're making games that kids might play, you work within society, within media, you have some sort of moral responsibility. I think that's mostly about understanding the society around you, and that's not rocket surgery either. What are the mores, the prevailing mores? What's okay to do when you're stepping over the lines? And the thing is, though the rules aren't absolute and hard, it's a matter of respect. You need to respect the current understanding of things in society around you. And last but not least, the red field, the emotional field, which is the one I've spent the most time with. I'm a very rational man, I'm a planning man. For those into Myers-Briggs, I have an INTJ personality type. But I know from a fact that what motivates me, makes me get out of bed in the morning, and what makes me able to stand up and talk to other people and motivate them as an entrepreneur, as a speaker, as any kind of leader, is that I feel good about what I'm doing. I truly believe in it. I want it to succeed for several reasons. So the emotional responsibility when doing something, a business venture, and especially one that fails, is considerable. And being able to go out and be willing to go into yourself and think about what does it mean to me, how can I make this a learning experience and something that strengthens me. Going here and holding this lecture, of course, is part of that, but so is getting back on the horse, staying in the games industry, starting new things or helping other people get on their way, sharing the experiences, are all ways to tell yourself and to understand yourself and understand your role in the great context of game development and how you fit into it as an individual. Now that's getting pretty abstract, but I still feel it's very important. And this last slide, before I go over with questions, is really the big learning experience for me. It's never over. I mean, no matter if the fat lady sings, no matter if a company goes bankrupt, no matter if you've suffered tremendous and tragic loss of something, life goes on. Very few things prevent the going on of life for you as an individual. And it's very easy to forget these things when the weather's stormy, when large things are happening that are largely outside of your control eventually. But there's always a reason to plan, there's always a reason to get back up, and there's always a reason to... sorry. I'm losing track a bit here, but there's always a reason to... something to look forward to. There's always a reason to make the most out of every experience. Well then, I'm going to move on to questions. I've used up about 15 more minutes. and hopefully I've brought across the main point of failing forwards, even if it's through a very personal lens.
Thank you. I have a question. I've experienced the same. I'm here. How did people in your environment respond to your bankruptcy? Because I know in the Netherlands they see it as a failure. Because I had the same period, same failure, bankruptcy, and then people think you fail. Do you A, think you failed yourself, and B, how did other people think so?
Well, the people who reacted the most strongly were other game company managers, because I think they felt the cold breath of death on their necks. So they sought me out immediately and went, "What happened? What happened?" Subtext, "How can I avoid it happening?" The bank, the lawyers, everyone else they had pipelines for this. They were very supportive of it. Family, friends, employees were incredibly supportive because we'd had such a transparent structure around everything, a very nice information flow. People know why it was happening, how it was happening, what the demarcation lines were. But in general in Sweden, bankruptcy is failure, is a permanent stain on your character. I've heard that in the US, bankruptcy is expected out of entrepreneurs, and having a couple of bankruptcies just means you've built a lot of experience and you've failed a lot in a positive sense. Americans that I speak to tell me it's not true. Europeans tell me America is a wonderland. But basically it's not nearly so harsh as I had imagined it to be. I've had nothing but support from the people around me, from macro to micro level.
Thanks,
That's
Ola.
it. Thank you.
Yep.
Too many words.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you very much.